The Interstellar Council chamber hung in the void like a polished obsidian tier, its transparent walls framing the swirling chaos of the Perseus arm. Inside, the air thrummed with the subtle harmonics of translation fields, each alien delegation sealed within their own resonant bubble, to accommodate the unbearable diversity of their physiologies. Nitrogen breathers, ammonia-blooded leviathans, crystalline lattice mines, 312 species, bound by a fragile covenant of mutual deterrence, gathered to adjudicate the fate of a newcomer. Daniel Carver stood alone in humanity's alcove, a solitary figure dwarfed by the scale of the assembly. At 48 standard years, he was a compact man with the weathered build of someone who had spent decades in the close confines of void-running freighters before rising through the ranks of the diplomatic service. His dark hair was threaded with silver, his eyes a steady gray that had witnessed the slow bleed of human expansion into the galaxy's empty margins. He wore the unadorned black tunic of a Terran envoy, its fabric woven with reactive fibers that kept his body temperature neutral amid the chamber's thermal flux. Carver had come to this place because humanity demanded it. For 2 centuries, human colonies had pushed into the interstellar dark, seeding worlds with fusion plants, orbital docks, and billions of lives. Contact with the Council had been inevitable, and the response equally so, a quarantine edict. Humanity was designated a provisional isolate, barred from the core trade lanes, the null-space conduits that spanned the galactic disk. The official rationale was developmental disparity. Humans were too young, too volatile, too prone to intraspecific violence. Unofficially, it was fear. The rapid spread of Saul's progeny defied the measured, bureaucratic sprawl of older empires. Now, standing before the chamber's central dais, Carver made the offer humanity had authorized. The words were transmitted in flawless high creche, the lingua franca of the Council, projected from the silver disk embedded in his throat. "The United Planets of Sol propose an accord," he said, his voice cutting through the chamber's susurrus of ambient translations. "A mutual defense and commerce treaty, open to all signatories. We seek no exclusionary privileges, no preferential conduits. We offer our industrial capacity shipyards, capable of producing a fleet tender in 6 standard months, and our navigational archives, which include stable routes through the Perseus debris fields that no other power has successfully charted. In exchange, we request recognition as a full member and an end to the quarantine." Silence followed, broken only by the faint osmotic hum of environmental systems. Then laughter erupted, not human laughter, but its alien equivalents. The Kreth Dominion delegation, a cluster of bioluminescent polyps floating in nutrient suspension, pulsed with rapid chromatic flares, their equivalent of derision. The Vorak Imperatrix, a towering mass of articulated chitin suspended from a skeletal harness, extruded a plume of pheromonal mockery that filled her bubble with acrid vapor. Even the austere lattice mines of the cipher concordance emitted a resonant cascade of dissonant harmonics, their crystalline forms fracturing light into mocking prisms. Ambassador Viren of the Kreth spoke first, its polyp cluster contracting into a tight spiral of contempt. "You presume to bargain as equals with civilizations that have weathered the long stasis and the null collapse? Your species has existed in the stellar commons for fewer than 300 rotations. You number barely 200 billion souls across a scattering of frontier worlds. And yet you demand access to the conduit's lifelines, forged over 10,000 years by powers that have forgotten more wars than you have fought." The Imperatrix's mandibles clicked in staccato rhythm. "Humanity's history is a catalog of self-inflicted cataclysms. You consume your own kind in ideological purges and resource wars. To grant you the keys to the galaxy would be to invite barbarism into the heart of civilization." Other voices rose in a cacophony of translated scorn. The Talari Concord likened humanity to a viral outbreak, uncontained and self-propagating. The Orden Enclave compared them to juvenile predators, all tooth and no discipline. The Chamber's collective judgment was clear. Humanity was an upstart, A swarm of clever vermin that had evaded notice only because it clung to the galaxy's ragged edges. Carver stood unmoved, his hands clasped behind his back. He had expected this. Every simulation, every wargame run in the shadowed halls of New Damascus Station had projected a rejection rate of 97%. But rejection was not defeat. "You mistake our request for supplication," he said evenly. "We do not beg for a seat at your table. We offer partnership because it serves mutual ends. The galaxy is not static. The null-space conduits decay. Entropy claims them at a rate of 2% per century. Our astrogators have mapped stable auxiliary routes bypasses that do not rely on your aging infrastructure. Our yards can repair and expand them. Refusal does not erase our presence. It merely ensures that we proceed without you." The laughter returned, sharper now, laced with the predatory satisfaction of predators dismissing prey. Vren's polyps flared a triumphant crimson. "Proceed, then, into the void you so eagerly claim. The quarantine holds because you lack the means to challenge it. Your ships are few, your conduits non-existent. You are a candle burning in vacuum brief and contained." Carver absorbed the dismissal without visible reaction, though inside, a familiar tension coiled in his gut. He had stood on the command deck of the UN Sundurance as it limped home from the Tau Ceti incursion, hull breached and crew halved, and listened to the same calculus of irrelevance from panicked officers. Survival had taught him that numbers lied. Strength was not counted in hulls or populations. It was forged in the dark places where hope ran thin and resolve thickened. "I hear your refusal," he said. "Peace is humanity's preference, not our necessity. There will be no further proposals from Sol." The chamber rippled with finality. The session dissolved into the procedural minutiae of formal rejection. Edicts reaffirmed. Patrol densities increased along the quarantine perimeter. Carver departed the dais without flourish, returning to the cramped confines of the human delegation's assigned transit module. A steel-walled box the size of a small warehouse, stocked with the minimal comforts of a species that built its homes from necessity rather than ostentation. Alone in the module's austere command blister, he removed the silver disk from its charging cradle and initiated the encrypted tight beam back to Sol. The message was simple. Offer declined, as projected. Standing orders? The reply came within the hour, relayed through a chain of untraceable microjumps. It was not a plan, nor a stratagem. It was a set of coordinates, 387 distinct stellar reference frames, scattered across a volume encompassing the Orion Spur, the Perseus Arm, and the trailing edge of the Norma Arm. No explanation accompanied them, only a single line of operational instruction. Transmit to all council members, unaccompanied by commentary. Carver studied the data packet, its holographic projections filling the blister with a web of navigational vectors. Each coordinate corresponded to a null-space egress point, a precise mathematical locus where controlled emergence was feasible. If these points held even a fraction of what he suspected, the implications were tectonic. He did not question the order. There were older currents in humanity's history threads woven through the Exodus fleets, the Long March, the founding of worlds in defiance of vacuum and isolation. Faith had been one such thread, not the brittle certainty of doctrine, but the quiet conviction that the universe was ordered, that survival was not mere accident. Carver had seen it in the eyes of dying spacers who clutched rosaries or murmured psalms as their ships tore apart. A refusal to believe that the precise balance of fusion containment and relativistic shielding was blind chance. Now, as he prepared the transmission, that same conviction settled over him. The Council had heard humanity's offer and chosen laughter. What they would receive next was silence made manifest. Hours later, every delegation, every fleet command, every planetary nexus, every null-space relay received the same anonymous packet. No preamble, no signature. Only coordinates, precise to within 100 meters of phase space. And in the shadowed vaults of human-occupied space, where fleets waited in the infinite hush of stealth fields, 387 points of null space began to shimmer with the first faint distortions of imminent emergence. Daniel Carver sat motionless in the command blister of the human transit module, the faint hum of the life support cyclers the only sound in the confined space. The holographic display before him cycled through status reports from the transmission relays. Every packet had been successfully dispatched. 387 sets of coordinates, each a precise mathematical incision into the fabric of null space, delivered without preamble, without demand, without threat. The Council's delegations had received them in the final hour of their deliberations, as they dispersed back to their respective bubbles of influence. He did not have to wait long for the response. The first indications came as scattered fragments queries relayed through neutral diplomatic channels, stripped of their usual bureaucratic ornamentation. The Kreth Dominion demanded clarification, accusing the transmission of being a deliberate attempt at navigational sabotage. The Vorak Imperatrix's office issued a terse bulletin, ordering her fleet commanders to conduct immediate phase space sweeps of the designated egress points. Even the Cipher Concordants, those methodical lattice minds who rarely deviated from exhaustive analysis, diverted processing capacity to parse the data for hidden algorithms or temporal traps. Carver watched the flood of intercepted communications with the detachment of a man observing the storm gather beyond a viewport. Human signals intelligence, distributed across a web of stealth pickets and false signature drones, painted a clear picture, confusion bordering on alarm. The coordinates were not random. They formed a constellation of emergence loci, distributed with geometric precision across the quarantine perimeter and deep into contested null space volumes. Yet no human presence ship, probe, or beacon occupied those points. It was as if the galaxy had been handed a map to a labyrinth that did not yet exist. In the hours that followed, the first verifications began. A Vorak heavy cruiser, the Spear of Unbroken Dominion, conducted an authorized null-space transit to the nearest coordinate cluster, a triad of egress points hovering at the edge of the Perseus debris fields. The ship's astrogation suite, calibrated to detect even the faintest phase distortions, registered anomalous gravitic shear's residual echoes of recent, large-scale emergence events. No wreckage, no debris, no energy signatures. Just the unmistakable imprint of mass greater than anything short of a battle squadron leaving stealth. Word spread like a pressure wave. A Kreth survey flotilla, comprising 34 scout vessels, jumped to a secondary locus near the trailing edge of the Orion Spur. Their sensor nets, designed to penetrate the cloaking fields of rival empires, lit up with the same impossible evidence. Null space displacement harmonics that corresponded to the simultaneous withdrawal of nearly 200 capital hulls, each in excess of 5 million tons. The flotilla's commander, a senior polyp cluster named Vran's own adjunct, transmitted a message of escalating urgency. The coordinates were exit vectors for a force that had been concealed in plain sight. By the end of the first standard day, the pattern was undeniable. Exploratory probes, dispatched by a dozen major powers, confirmed it across 47 distinct coordinate clusters. Hundreds of emergence points, each bearing the spectral fingerprints of recent fleet maneuvers. Hundreds, not the scattered remnants of a frontier navy, scraping together what few assets it could muster, but a distributed armada, methodical, patient, and utterly invisible. Carver received the consolidated intelligence brief from Sol as the second day broke over the interstellar relay. The report was stark. The transmissions had unveiled the barest fraction of humanity's true posture. For 7 years, under the guise of routine industrial expansion and colonization efforts, the Terran Combined Fleet had executed Operation Silent Aegis, a program of continuous rolling deployments. Every capital ship, every cruiser squadron, every auxiliary tender had been maneuvered into concealed null-space redoubts, their signatures masked by a lattice of experimental gravitic baffles and phase-cloaked waystations. The result was not a single hidden fleet, but an archipelago of them, 387 independent strike concentrations, totaling over 20,000 warships, positioned to interdict every major council conduit, every primary trade nexus, every strategic shipyard, from the inner Perseus to the Norma frontier. It was a posture of absolute strategic encirclement, achieved without a single overt violation of the quarantine. Humanity had not built a fleet to conquer the galaxy. It had built one to hold it at bay. Carver allowed himself a single measured breath as he reviewed the deployment map. The scale of it pressed against the edges of comprehension. He had known fragments of the planned briefings on the baffling technology that allowed ships to linger in null space without decohering, the logistical miracle of sustaining crews in prolonged stealth. But seeing the full tapestry laid bare was like staring into the depths of a bottomless sea. Men and women, millions of them, had lived in silence for years, their lives suspended in the cold equilibrium between emergence and annihilation, holding position because the order had come down from the highest echelons of the United Planets. Do not reveal yourselves until the Council forces our hand. He thought of his own son, Captain Elias Carver, commanding the heavy cruiser Vigilant Resolve and the Epsilon Indi redoubt. Elias had been among the first to volunteer for extended null-space immersion, leaving behind a wife and 2 young daughters on New Damascus. When Carver had asked him why, his son had answered without hesitation, "Because someone has to stand watch. If it's just us against the dark, then we hold the line until the stars themselves tell us otherwise." That answer had carried the weight of something older than strategy, a conviction rooted in the marrow of human endurance. Not the blind faith of zealots, but the hard-won certainty of a species that had crawled out of gravity wells, tamed fusion fire, and crossed voids that devoured lesser wills. It was the belief that order was not an accident, that the universe permitted survival not through caprice, but through the disciplined application of will against entropy. As the third day dawned, Ambassador Viren requested an emergency session. The Kreth delegation's transmission was devoid of its former bluster. The polyp cluster's bioluminescent patterns flickered with uncharacteristic restraint. Other powers followed, their voices stripped of condescension. The coordinates had forced a reckoning. Exploratory efforts continued, revealing more clusters, more echoes of concealed power. No human vessel had been detected, no communication intercepted, yet the implications were inescapable. Humanity possessed the means to sever the galaxy's circulatory system at a moment's notice. Carver prepared for the confrontation, reviewing the brief that would constitute humanity's sole response. There would be no bluster, no enumeration of hull counts or tonnage. The fleets spoke for themselves. The emergency session convened amid a rising tide of uncertainty. Delegations that had once filled the chamber with laughter now radiated unease, their sensor bubbles pulsing with frantic data exchanges. Vran's voice, transmitted in clipped high creche, broke the silence first. "Envoy Carver, explain the meaning of these transmissions." The indicated loci contain evidence of concealed military concentrations on a scale inconsistent with the quarantine's parameters. If this is provocation, clarify your intentions. Carver stood before the central dais, his posture unchanged from the day of his humiliation. For the first time, the chamber listened without interruption. "There is nothing to explain," he said. "You were offered peace. A treaty that would have bound our strength to your mutual defense, our industry to your prosperity. You declined. The coordinates were transmitted so that you would understand the alternative. The silence that followed was absolute, the weight of unseen armies pressing down through the void. And in that silence, for the first time, the Council began to wonder what manner of creatures could hide such power, and what it would take to make them unleash it. The emergency session of the Interstellar Council stretched into its 8th hour, the chamber's ambient harmonics fraying under the strain of unaccustomed silence. The transparent walls, once a backdrop for triumphant posturing, now seemed to magnify the unease that permeated every delegation. Sensor bubbles flickered erratically as astrogation teams across the galaxy continued their frantic sweeps. confirming what the coordinates had already proclaimed. Humanity had not merely evaded detection, it had orchestrated a deception so vast that its unveiling left the elder empires grasping for the scale of their own vulnerability. Daniel Carver remained at the central dais, unmoved by the shifting currents around him. The weight of scrutiny pressed in from all sides, the cleft polyps pulsing in erratic, conflicted spirals. The Vorak Imperatrix's chitinous form rigid with suppressed fury. The cipher concordance's lattice minds refracting light into a storm of unresolved computational cascades. For the first time, no one interrupted him. "Your transmissions," Viren said at last, its voice stripped of its earlier venom, "reveal phase displacement signatures consistent with the simultaneous withdrawal of over 20,000 capital warships. This is not the posture of an isolated newcomer. This is the configuration of a power that has deliberately concealed itself within the null-space topology of every major conduit." "Explain the purpose of this deception." Carver met the polyp cluster's bioluminescent gaze without flinching. "Deception implies hostile intent. There has been none. Humanity has respected the quarantine in every particular. No vessel has violated designated exclusionary volumes. No overt military action has been taken. We have simply prepared for the possibility that peace would not be offered." The Imperatrix's mandibles parted in a slow, deliberate rasp. "Prepared? You have positioned forces capable of interdicting the entire network of primary conduits. Every trade route, every supply chain, every fleet concentration lies within tactical reach of these emergence points. If this is preparation, it is preparation for war." Carver allowed the accusation to settle, his expression unchanging. "It is preparation for survival. For 200 years, your council has treated humanity as an anomaly to be contained, a species too fractious, too expansionist, too prone to violence to be trusted with the mechanisms of interstellar order. You have barred us from the conduits, restricted our access to shared resources, and patrolled our borders with the vigilance reserved for an encroaching foe. Under those conditions, it is not deception to ensure that we cannot be casually erased." A murmur rippled through the chamber, a dozen simultaneous translations weaving a tapestry of dawning comprehension. The Talari Concord's emissary, a shimmering veil of plasma filaments, spoke in a voice like distant thunder. "You claim no intent to strike, yet the capacity is there. What prevents you from executing it?" "Nothing," Carver replied. His tone carried the weight of simple, unadorned fact. "Accept our own decision. We offered alliance. You chose isolation. The fleets exist because the universe does not reward the defenseless." The admission hung in the chamber like the aftershock of a null-space rupture. For the elder empires, whose wars had been fought across millennia of carefully calibrated standoffs, the concept defied their strategic axioms. Power was declared, quantified, and balanced through treaties and mutual vulnerability. It was not hidden in silence, held in reserve until necessity demanded its revelation. The Kreth, whose dominion had been forged in the open clash of bioluminescent armadas, recoiled from the notion of an adversary that preferred invisibility to display. The Vorak, bred for the ritualized brutality of frontal assaults, found the idea of a force that could choose to remain unseen profoundly unsettling. In the privacy of his thoughts, Carver felt the familiar tension of standing at the precipice of irreversible choice. He was no admiral, no fleet commander issuing orders from the shadowed heart of a battleship. He was a diplomat, raised in the cramped habdomes of Epsilon Eridani, where the failure of a single recycling plant could doom 10,000 lives. He had learned early that strength was not the absence of fear, but the will to act despite it. And yet, as the chamber grappled with the implications of humanity's hidden power, a quiet doubt gnawed at him. Was this unveiling truly a path to peace, or merely the prelude to a war fought in the dark? He pushed the uncertainty aside. Doubt was a luxury for peacetime. The fleets had been held in readiness not out of bloodlust, but because history had taught humanity that mercy unbacked by resolve was indistinguishable from surrender. His father, a chief engineer on the Long March convoy, had drilled that truth into him. You don't beg a storm to spare you. You build a ship that can weather it. As the session dragged on, the interrogations grew more pointed. Fleet commanders demanded precise force dispositions. Astrogators pleaded for navigational data to disprove the scale of the encirclement. Carver offered neither. The coordinates themselves were the answer, and further elaboration would dilute their impact. Finally, Vren's cluster contracted into a tight, luminous spiral of reluctant clarity. You have demonstrated that you possess the means to wage a war that would fracture the conduits and isolate every major power. What is your demand? Carver regarded the assembly with the steady calm of a man who had already spent his words on offers freely refused. There are no demands. We offered peace. You declined. The fleets are in position because we will not permit our extinction. Whether they remain dormant or are committed to action is a choice that rests solely with humanity. The chamber fell into a stunned hush. For the first time, the elder empires confronted not merely the fact of human power, but its deliberate restraint. This was no bluff, no extravagant posturing backed by empty hulls. The fleets were real, their positions meticulously maintained over years of silent vigilance. And they had not moved. In the aftermath of the session, as delegations withdrew to their private enclaves to digest the implications, Carver retreated to the human module. There, in the confines of the command blister, he accessed a secure channel to the nearest fleet command relay. The face that resolved in the holodisplay belonged to Admiral Maria Costas, commander of the Perseus armed deployment. They have seen the board, Carver said without preamble. They understand the position. Costas, her features carved from the same unyielding granite as the men and women under her command, nodded. And they know we have not played our pieces. He studied her for a moment, searching for the human cost beneath the operational dispassion. How are the crews holding up? 7 years in stealth fields is not something that comes without a price. Her eyes did not waver. They hold because they believe in the reason. Not in conquest or vengeance or some dream of galactic empire. They hold because no one else will stand between humanity and oblivion. Carver nodded, the words resonating with a conviction he had felt but never fully articulated. In the quiet moments between crises, when the weight of isolation pressed hardest, there was always that undercurrent, a sense that their survival, improbable as it was, carried the imprint of purpose. Not the crude determinism of predestined victory, but the subtle order that allowed a single species, born on a fragile blue world, to defy the crushing anonymity of the void. As he severed the connection, a faint tremor registered through the module's inertial dampers, an automated sensor sweep from one of the Council's patrol squadrons, probing the edges of human-occupied space. The gesture was futile, a reflex born of the need to reassert control in the face of the unknown. Carver watched the readings without alarm. The fleets remained hidden, their presence a shadow cast across the galaxy's strategic heart. And in that shadow, the elder empires began to understand that the true measure of humanity's strength lay not in the fleets themselves, but in the choice to withhold them. For now, the days following the emergency session marked a profound shift in the Interstellar Council's rhythm. The chamber, once a theater of unassailable certainties, became a crucible of doubt. Delegations that had dismissed humanity as an insignificant frontier swarm now filled their allotted sensor bubbles with ceaseless data streams, astrogation models recalculating transit times under interdiction scenarios, logistical simulations projecting the collapse of supply chains, and probabilistic analyses estimating the duration of a coordinated emergence. The coordinates had not merely revealed a fleet. They had exposed the fragility of the galaxy's carefully maintained equilibrium. Daniel Carver observed this unraveling from the human module's austere confines, the walls lined with sensor feeds and holographic projections that mapped the rising tide of Council activity. Exploratory probes continued to confirm the scope of humanity's concealed deployments. Null-space redoubts positioned to sever the primary conduits with surgical precision. Yet no human ship had emerged, no communication issued, no ultimatum delivered. The silence was the message, and its weight pressed relentlessly upon the elder empires. Internal discord began to fracture the Council's unity. The Kreth Dominion, whose polyp clusters thrived on the visibility of massed formations, argued for a preemptive mobilization, deploying their luminous armadas to contest the suspected emergence points and force humanity into revealing its full strength. The Vorak Imperatrix, her martial instincts honed by centuries of ritualized combat, advocated for a direct challenge, a mass transit through the most heavily shadowed vectors, daring the humans to strike. But others, particularly the Cipher Concordants, urged caution. Their lattice minds, capable of simulating billions of tactical permutations in parallel, projected catastrophic outcomes. A war in which every conduit fell silent, isolating core worlds and condemning entire empires to slow strangulation. Carver listened to the intercepted debates without interference. He understood the paralysis they induced. The elder powers operated within a paradigm of visible deterrence, where strength was measured in the ostentatious parade of fleets and the mutual certainty of retaliation. Humanity's strategy defied this logic. The fleets did not broadcast their presence. They waited, unseen, their very existence a demonstration that power need not be expended to be felt. In the quiet hours between transmissions, Carver wrestled with the human cost of this restraint. He had reviewed the personnel reports from Silent Aegis, crews confined to null space for rotations at a time, their ships suspended in a limbo where time dilated and psychological strain mounted inexorably. Medical logs detailed the toll chronic isolation syndrome, the creeping disorientation of prolonged stealth field immersion, the knowledge that any error in phase coherence could consign an entire squadron to dissolution. Yet desertion rates remained negligible, mutiny non-existent. The crews endured because they had been given a purpose beyond survival, to hold the line until humanity's place in the galaxy was secure, not by conquest, but by the simple fact of their refusal to be erased. One evening, as the relay station's artificial night cycle dimmed the blister's illumination, Carver accessed a private channel to the UN Indomitable, a battlecruiser anchored in the heart of the Perseus redoubt. His son's face appeared in the holodisplay, etched with the gauntness of extended immersion. Elias Carver was 36, his features bearing the same stubborn lines as his father, though the years in stealth had hollowed his cheeks and shadowed his eyes. "They're coming apart," Daniel said without preamble. "The Council is debating whether to strike first or wait for us to blink." Elias's expression remained steady. "They won't strike. Every simulation they run shows the same outcome. We cut the conduits, and their empires bleed out. They can't afford to test us. And if they do, then we do what we've prepared for." Elias paused, his gaze drifting momentarily to something beyond the pickup, a bulkhead etched with faded script, a verse from the Psalms. "Father, there are times when I wonder if we're tempting Providence, holding so many souls in the dark for so long. But then I look at the crew. They pray in the mess halls. They mark each rotation with services, even when the clocks lose meaning. They believe there's an order to this, a reason we haven't been lost yet." Daniel felt the weight of that belief settle over him. He had never been a man of overt piety. His faith had been forged in the practicalities of survival, in the improbable precision of systems that kept fragile human bodies alive amid cosmic indifference. Yet he could not deny the pattern. The fleets held their phase locks through storms that should have torn them apart, supply chains threading the debris fields without loss, crews emerging from immersion with their sanity intact. It was not luck. Luck did not sustain millions in the unrelenting pressure of null space. "You hold because you have to," Daniel said. "And because there's something in us that refuses to yield until the alternative is annihilation." The conversation ended, but its resonance lingered. As the next council convocation approached, the delegations coalesced around a unified front. A formal demand for parley, issued through neutral channels and stripped of prior arrogance. They requested Ambassador Carver's presence, not as a petitioner, but as a representative empowered to clarify humanity's intentions. The session convened under a pall of subdued formality. Vren's polyp cluster, its luminous spirals muted, spoke for the assembly. The scale and disposition of your concealed forces constitute a threat that cannot be ignored. Yet no overt action has been taken. If humanity seeks something beyond the mere demonstration of capacity, state it plainly. Carver stood at the dais, his voice carrying the unyielding clarity of a man who had already laid his cards upon the table. There is nothing more to state. You were offered an alliance, a partnership in which our strength would have served the common defense. You rejected it, deeming us unworthy of trust. The fleets demonstrate that we require no one's permission to defend ourselves. They remain in position not to coerce you, but to ensure that no power, council or otherwise, can impose its will upon us without consequence. The Imperatrix's mandibles scraped in agitation. You speak of defense, yet your posture allows you to dictate terms to the entire galaxy. No, Carver replied. It allows us to refuse terms dictated to us. Peace remains our preference. But peace is not granted by those who laugh at offers of reconciliation. It is secured by those who possess the means to enforce it. The chamber absorbed this truth in silence. For the first time, the elder empires confronted the core of humanity's position. They were not asking for a seat at the table. They were demonstrating that they could, if necessary, overturn the table entirely, and had chosen for now not to. As the session dissolved into private deliberations, Carver returned to the module, the weight of the exchange settling into a hard-won clarity. The fleets had forced a reckoning, but the choice of what came next remained human. Mercy, he understood, was not the absence of strength. It was the deliberate withholding of it. Yet even as the council grappled with this new reality, faint distortions began registering across the null space. Arrays microscopic phase fluctuations at the very edges of the designated emergence points. Exploratory probes returned fragmented readings, residual wakes of vessels testing their cloaks, shifting position within the hidden redoubts. The fleets were moving. Not emerging, not striking, but repositioning, adjusting their vigil with the subtle menace of a predator circling its territory. And in the shadowed depths where humanity's armada waited, the quiet conviction grew that the true test of their resolve had only just begun. Daniel Carver stood alone in the human module's observation blister. The faint glow of the relay station's transit lanes cast in long shadows across the unadorned bulkheads. The holographic displays surrounding him pulsed with intercepted data streams, reports from Council astrogation teams registering the subtle, inexorable repositioning of humanity's concealed fleets. The movements were not aggressive, no massed emergences, no overt maneuvers toward interdiction vectors, but they were unmistakable. Squadrons shifted within their null-space redoubts, realigning their phase locks to cover newly identified vulnerabilities in the conduit network. It was a quiet escalation, a reminder that the fleets were not static monuments, but living instruments of will, ready to adapt, to tighten the noose without ever drawing it shut. The human cost of this silent campaign weighed heavier on Carver with each passing rotation. He had spent the previous night reviewing the latest medical summaries from the redoubts documents that cataloged the toll of prolonged immersion in a way that no strategic brief could convey. Crews confined to ships suspended between realities endured not merely isolation, but the relentless erosion of temporal continuity. Null space warped time's flow. Minutes on the outside stretched to hours within, compressing years into a disorienting cascade of subjective experience. Psychological strain manifested in subtle fractures, vivid dreams that bled into waking hours, a pervasive sense of detachment from the universe beyond the hull, the knowledge that any failure in the stealth fields would consign them to instantaneous dispersal. Yet the reports also revealed a resilience that defied the metrics of attrition. Desertion remained statistically insignificant. Operational readiness held at 98% across all formations. Embedded chaplains, priests, imams, rabbis, and secular counselors, documented a pattern of response that transcended mere discipline. Crews marked a passage of rotations with rituals, shared meals in cramped mess halls, readings from sacred texts etched into bulkhead panels, silent observances in the cold vacuum of observation galleries. Men and women who had volunteered for these unseen watches spoke of a conviction that went beyond duty. They endured because they believed their presence imposed an order on chaos, a deliberate assertion of humanity's refusal to vanish into the galaxy's indifferent expanse. Carver understood this conviction intimately. He had grown up on a colony world where every breath depended on the flawless interplay of automated systems, where survival hung on the improbable precision of engineering and will. There had been no room for the illusion of cosmic accident. The stars themselves seemed to demand a purpose, a pattern that favored those who imposed structure on the void. The Council's response to the fleet movements was swift and fractured. Emergency conclaves multiplied, their deliberations leaking through compromised diplomatic channels. The Kreth Dominion advocated for a unified cordon, an attempt to envelop the suspected redoubts with sensor nets and standoff munitions, forcing the humans to either emerge and fight or reveal the limits of their stealth technology. The Vorak Imperatrix proposed a bolder measure, a series of sacrificial transits, deliberately routing major fleet elements through the most shadowed vectors to provoke a response. But dissent grew among the more deliberative powers. The Cipher Concordance's simulations, shared under duress with other delegations, painted a bleak arithmetic. Any attempt to force engagement would trigger retaliatory emergences that severed the primary conduits, isolating core industrial bases for decades. The cost and economic collapse and logistical strangulation exceeded even the most pessimistic estimates of outright defeat. In the midst of this mounting paralysis, a delegation arrived at the human module, unannounced, unsanctioned, and unprecedented. Ambassador Viaran, accompanied by a single adjunct cluster and a pair of cipher analytical nodes, requested entry. Carver granted it without protest, watching as the Kreth envoy's nutrient suspension pod maneuvered into the confined space, its bioluminescent pulses subdued and irregular. "We do not come to demand," Viaran stated, its voice stripped of prior condescension. "We come to understand. Your fleets hold positions that could dismantle the interstellar order. Yet they do not strike. Your crews endure conditions that our own simulations deem unsustainable for more than 2 rotations, without catastrophic degradation. Why?" Carver regarded the polyp cluster steadily. "Because annihilation is not our goal. We hold these positions to ensure that no other power can impose it upon us. The fleets exist to make our survival a fact, not a carried the weight of confirmation. The fleets had held, not merely through technology or discipline, but through the quiet insistence that survival was more than accident. And as the Council turned from confrontation toward negotiation, that insistence began to reshape the contours of the galactic order. But in the shadowed depths of the redoubts, where millions still waited in silence, the question lingered: how long could restraint endure before the first fracture demanded release? The negotiation framework, born from the stark reality of the relentless emergence, unfolded in a series of closed sessions that stripped away the Council's former veneer of superiority. No longer conducted from the grand central dais of the interstellar chamber, the talks took place in a neutral transit nexus, a Spartan orbital facility suspended between the relay station and the nearest null-space conduit. Here, away from the spectacle of assembled delegations, representatives of the major powers met with Daniel Carver and a small cadre of human observers, their discussions transmitted under stringent encryption protocols. The substance of the negotiations was as unyielding as the steel walls that enclosed them. The Council proposed a graduated de-escalation, a mutual cessation of all probe operations and quarantine patrols, followed by the phased withdrawal of human fleet elements from the most strategically sensitive redoubts, specifically those positioned to interdict the primary conduit spines. In exchange, they offered provisional access to a limited number of auxiliary transit lanes, coupled with formal recognition of humanity's status as a co-equal participant in the galactic order. Carver's response was deliberate and uncompromising. Withdrawals without reciprocal assurance of security are not de-escalation, they are unilateral disarmament. The fleets will reposition only under synchronized, verifiable conditions. The complete suspension of all exclusionary protocols, the dismantling of quarantine sensor grids, and the establishment of mutual observation regimes that ensure no power can reimpose containment without detection. We will not expose our defensive posture while your fleets retain the freedom to encircle and strike. The representatives absorbed this without protest. The relentless micro-emergence had demonstrated the peril of forcing humanity's hand. Further attempts to test the limits of concealed deployments risked a response that no simulation could fully predict. The elder empires, for all their accumulated history, found themselves compelled to accept terms that inverted their foundational strategic axioms. Power, they had always believed, was a matter of visible mass and mutual exposure. Fleets deployed in open formation, where every hull served as both sword and shield. Humanity's doctrine of strength held in reserve, deployed only when necessity demanded, exposed the brittleness of that paradigm. To demand that the fleets emerge fully was to invite the very disruption they most feared. As the sessions progressed, the human delegation laid bare the rationale that underpinned their restraint. Carver spoke not of technological supremacy, but of the imperatives that had forged it. Our fleets have held their positions for years in conditions that your own analyses deem unsustainable. This is not because we possess some unique resilience beyond the capacity of other species, but because our survival has always required it. We are a species born on a single marginal world, surrounded by vacuum that permits no retreat. We cross the voids not as conquerors, but as survivors who refuse to accept erasure as an acceptable outcome. One of the cipher representatives, its lattice form humming with the subtle vibrations of parallel computation, posed the question that had lingered unspoken since the fleet's unveiling. This endurance, this capacity to maintain operational integrity under prolonged isolation derives from what you term belief. Clarify the nature of this factor. Carver considered the crystalline emissary, its facets refracting the chamber's muted light into 1,000 precise echoes. Belief is the recognition that existence is not a series of random collisions. The universe permits survival through the maintenance of order against disorder. Every system, whether a fusion plant holding a plasma core within micrometer tolerances or a fleet, sustaining phase coherence in null-space functions because it imposes structure where chaos would otherwise prevail. Our crews endure because they understand that their vigilance is an extension of that same imperative. They do not merely wait. They assert that their continued presence is meaningful, willed into being by the underlying intelligence that allows such fragile constructs to persist. The admission hung in the chamber, its implications rippling through the assembled representatives. For species whose civilizations had evolved under the relentless logic of visible hierarchies and enforced equilibria, the human perspective defied categorization. It was neither the fatalism of those resigned to cosmic indifference, nor the arrogance of presumed supremacy. It was the conviction that survival was an active choice, ratified by the very structure of reality. Over the course of 12 standard rotations, the framework hardened into a binding accord. The Council agreed to the immediate termination of all quarantine measures, the withdrawal of exclusionary patrol squadrons, and the establishment of a joint verification regime, distributed sensor platforms manned by mixed crews to monitor the repositioning of human fleets. In return, humanity committed to a staged withdrawal from 80% of its redoubts over the following 2 years, retaining only those concentrations necessary to secure its primary colonial approaches. No forced deployments would occur without mutual notification, and no power, human or otherwise, would contest the other's sovereign transit corridors. The signing of the accord marked the end of the crisis that had begun with laughter and coordinates. Yet as the protocols took effect, Carver witnessed the human cost of the victory in stark relief. Fleet reports detailed the first large-scale emergences, squadrons withdrawing from their deepest null-space redoubts, their crews confronting the disorienting rush of resynchronization with baseline reality. Medical logs recorded the toll temporal readjustment syndrome, the psychological aftershocks of years spent in dilated isolation. But alongside the strain came a pervasive sense of release, tempered by an unbroken discipline. Chaplains and commanders alike noted the same refrain in after-action debriefs. The vigil had been endured because it was necessary, and its conclusion affirmed the order that had sustained them. In the final session, Vion approached Carver privately, its polyp cluster radiating a subdued, contemplative luminescence. You have secured what you sought without unleashing the forces you held in reserve. This is a form of victory that our histories do not adequately describe, Carver nodded. Victory is not always found in the application of force. Sometimes it is found in demonstrating that force need not be applied. The envoy's lights pulsed once, a final ripple of understanding. Mercy, then. Not as submission, but as the deliberate withholding of what could destroy. As the Accord's implementation began, petrol squadrons withdrawing, sensor grids powering down, the first human flotillas emerging into verifiable transit, the galaxy shifted incrementally toward a new equilibrium. The fleets that had shadowed the conduits in silence took up station in open space, their presence no longer a concealed threat, but an acknowledged reality. Yet in the quiet aftermath, as Carver prepared to depart the relay station, a final report arrived from the emerging squadrons. Across dozens of vessels, crews reported a singular phenomenon during their transition from null space. Phase field stabilizations that exceeded projected tolerances, occurring in precise alignment with distributed observances, prayers, rituals, and moments of collective reflection. The anomalies were minor, statistically improbable but consistently replicable, as if the distributed focus of human will had imposed a faint but measurable order on the probabilistic flux of emergence. Carver reviewed the data in silence, the faint imprint of purpose threading through the cold mathematics of phase mechanics. It was no overt intervention, no violation of the physical order. But in the moment of greatest vulnerability, when every hull teetered on the brink of decoherence, the crews had emerged intact. And in that emergence, the truth of their conviction stood revealed. Mercy was not merely a strategic restraint, but an expression of the deeper intelligence that permitted a species born in isolation to claim its place among the stars. The Accord's implementation unfolded across the galactic expanse with the measured precision of a long-deferred dawn. Sensor grids that had enforced humanity's quarantine for 2 centuries powered down in sequence, their exclusionary fields collapsing into inert silence. Patrol squadrons withdrew from contested vectors, their commanders issuing terse acknowledgments of the new operational reality. Across 387 redoubts, the concealed fleets began their phased emergence, not as a sudden unleashing of wrath, but as a deliberate restoration of visibility. Squadron by squadron, battle group by battle group, vessels materialized from the null space veil, their hulls bearing the subtle scars of years in prolonged immersion. Micrometeorite pits masked by stealth baffles, hull plates annealed from the constant strain of phase-locked suspension. Daniel Carver observed the process from a command shuttle en route to New Damascus Station, the heart of humanity's Perseus arm bastion. The tactical displays filled with the ordered exodus, cruisers and tenders emerging into baseline space, their formation integrity unbroken, their crews transitioning from the warped temporal flow of the redoubts to the steady march of galactic time. Medical summaries streamed in from the first wave's reports of temporal readjustment, the inevitable disorientation of minds and bodies, forced to reconcile years of subjective isolation with the unyielding progression of external clocks. Yet the cohesion held. No vessel suffered catastrophic decoherence. No squadrons fragmented under the strain of release. In the aftermath of emergence, the human fleets did not disperse into triumphal parades or aggressive forward deployments. They assumed stations along the primary approaches to human space, defensive concentrations that secured colonial lifelines without threatening the conduits themselves. The elder empires, their strategic calculus irrevocably altered, refrained from contesting these positions. The Accord's verification protocols ensured transparency. Joint sensor platforms, manned by mixed crews, monitored every repositioning, confirming that humanity's power, once hidden, now stood openly accountable. Carver reflected on this denouement as the shuttle approached New Damascus, its orbital yards a constellation of skeletal frameworks and fusion flares. The crisis had been resolved without a single shot fired, without the fleets ever committing to the full scope of their destructive potential. Yet the victory carried a resonance deeper than strategic success. It lay in the simple, unyielding fact that humanity had imposed its continued existence upon a galaxy that had sought to contain it, not through the expenditure of force, but through the sustained refusal to be provoked into it. On the station, he walked the decks where returning crews disembarked, their faces marked by the gaunt pallor of prolonged immersion. Captain Elias Carver met him in a cavernous receiving bay, surrounded by spacers emerging from quarantine decon. The younger man's frame had thinned further in the final rotations, but his eyes held the steady clarity of one who had seen the edge of endurance and found it survivable. "They held the line," Elias said, gesturing to the men and women dispersing into the station's labyrinthine corridors. "Every diagnostic confirms it. The phase locks never failed, not in storms that should have torn lesser formations apart. The crews say it was more than engineering. They say they were permitted to endure." Daniel nodded, his gaze sweeping the bay. Crews moved with the quiet purpose of those who had carried an impossible burden and emerged intact. Chaplains conducted brief services in alcoves, spacers kneeling or standing in silent reflection. A young engineering officer, her uniform still bearing the faint iridescence of null-space residue, murmured to a companion, "It wasn't luck. Systems don't hold that close to failure without something holding them together." The elder empires came to comprehend this truth in the months that followed. The fleets, no longer phantoms lurking in null-space shadows, patrolled their assigned volumes with disciplined restraint. Trade resumed through conduits unthreatened by interdiction, and humanity's shipyards, whose output had sustained the silent vigil, began contributing to repair and expansion efforts under the Accord's terms. The Council, stripped of its pretensions of unchallenged primacy, accepted humanity not as a tolerated anomaly, but as a necessary counterweight in the galactic balance. VRN transmitted a final communication to Carver before departing the relay station. The polyp cluster's luminous spirals flowed with an uncharacteristic steadiness. "We sought to contain you as a provisional threat, believing your isolation would suffice. We discovered instead that you had prepared for the precise measure of our disbelief. Peace has been secured not through your submission, nor through the annihilation of opposition, but through the deliberate withholding of what you could have unleashed. This is a form of strength our histories do not name." Carver's reply was concise. "It is mercy. Not the mercy of the weak, who lack the means to refuse it, but the mercy of those who possess the power to end all mercy and choose instead to withhold it." In the years that followed, the Accord held. The fleets that had encircled the galaxy in silence became its quiet guardians present, vigilant, but unmoved by provocations that would have compelled lesser powers to escalation. The elder empires learned to navigate a reality in which humanity's strength was no longer a hidden threat, but a visible restraint. And in the human colonies, where the memory of quarantine lingered like a half-faded scar, the lesson took deeper root. Survival was not merely endured, but asserted through the disciplined exercise of power held in check. Carver stood one final time in the observation gallery of New Damascus Station, watching as a squadron of newly emerged cruisers took up station against the starfield. The vessels hung in perfect formation, their hulls catching the light of a distant primary. There was no fanfare, no declaration of dominance. Only the quiet certainty of presence. The galaxy had laughed at the offer of peace, secure in its presumption of human irrelevance. It had received instead the coordinates of a strength that could have shattered its foundations. And in the silence that followed, silence purchased not by capitulation, but by the resolute refusal to strike humanity, demonstrated the essence of its will. Mercy, it turned out, required a blade sharp enough to carve obedience from the void.